My musky flies, I like to tie on these Gamakatsu SL12Ss, and I put a split ring on it because we're going to attach the front half of the hook to, or the front half of the fly is going to be tied on one of these Waddington shanks. So we'll use this split ring as our attachment point for the shank. Okay, so the first thing to get started, basically we just need to, just like any other fly, get some thread started on the hook. And so we're going to use a lot of synthetic materials and a little bit of bucktail, a lot of crystal, a lot of flash boo, and a lot of SF blend, synthetic fibers. So essentially we just start and get a core of the tail built out of flash boo and SF fiber. So when we tie this in, I like to tie in several smaller chunks because it's easier to control and easier to tie it in well than it is with one really big piece. And when we go to tie these in, I like to reverse it and fold it over so that we really lock it down in. So we'll start, you notice I kind of got it here with the long end pointing away from the point of the hook. And I'm kind of at the, I don't know, call it 80% mark. And we'll just tie it down in right on top of the hook. It's kind of important to make sure that we get this tied in right on top of the hook so that the fly doesn't want to spin once we get it in the water. And then we'll just take it, fold it back over, and tie it down, and then we'll start forming the core of this back half of the fly. And then we'll start layering in some flash, and we'll just do layers of flash and layers of SF fiber until we get up towards the eye of the hook, and then we'll put a little collar of spun deer hair on there. When you cut this flash off and set it in there, you'll get it, and whenever you cut it, and you'll end up with nice even ends. So I just like to kind of roll it and pull it through my fingers a little bit so that those ends get a little uneven, and it helps build a little taper into the body. And then we'll do it the same way. We'll just kind of reverse it in, and then fold it back on over top of itself and bind it down. Every once in a while, it's a good idea to throw a half hitch in there, just in case something pops off and it comes undone, the whole thing doesn't unravel. When you tie in your next bunch of SF fiber or whatever synthetic material you're using, I like to tie it in and sort of spread it around the hook shank just a little bit so that those ends start to cover my wraps, and it helps hold all my flash in place and gives that thread a little bit of protection just in case something big grabs a hold of it and bites all the way to the hook. I like to vary the colors of my flash that are in there and finish out with something that's a little bit darker but still kind of in the same kind of color tone as the rest of the fly. So we'll finish up, we'll add some silver and some pearl, and then we'll finish up with that sea green kind of dark chartreusey stuff. Just add another little layer of SF fibers on there. When you're doing this, you can, if you want to get real fancy with it, you can put some epoxy or some CCG or sallies over top of these thread wraps and give them a little bit more protection, but I don't really worry about it. I figure by the time it gets chewed up, if the tail's falling apart, it's probably done being fished anyways. The hard part when you're doing this is just making sure that all these materials stay on top of the hook. It'll help keep that fly from spinning in the water. Wrap that down and then we'll finish it off with a little bit of this sea green flashy boo. I think it's sea green. It might be ocean green or something like that. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of dark green.
What is this going to be mimicking? This fly?
I don't really think that they mimic much, especially this time of year, because we tend to fish a lot of bright colors. If anything, yeah, I mean, I could say it looks like a big shiner or a big fall fish. You want it to generically look like a big fish, but half the time I think muskies, it's like playing with a giant cat. You just gotta find something that they find attractive and get it to, you know, twitch it around in front of it until he decides to pounce. All right, we'll add one more kind of veil of SF fiber across the top of this. And on this one, I'll kind of roll it around most of the way around the hook shank. Just kind of help cover up some of those thread wraps down on the bottom. And then just kind of split it and pull it back around with everything else. Tie it down and we'll put a little collar or bucktail on there. And then when I pick my bucktail off of that, when I cut it off the actual tail, I want to look for length that's kind of crinkly and not too stiff. And I generally want to go with the less is more approach, because it's easy to get way too much on there and make that collar hard to attach. Plus make it soak up a lot of water and make it difficult to throw. We're just going to get it to flare all the way around the hook. You can see I've kind of got it reverse tied in there. So I'm going to do it the same way as I've done everything else, is pull it back down and kind of reverse it back over itself. Tie a little thread dam in front of it there, and all those bits of bucktail out of the way so we can tie that thread off. And then that finishes out the back half of the fly. And it looks a little unkempt and unfinished, but it doesn't make any difference. We're going to put the head on there in a minute. And just a little bit of nail polish on those wraps, and we'll call it good. Okay. We'll kind of pop this out and set it to the side and let it dry. And we'll start on the front end. There we go. We'll get that shank so that it sets in the vise. And now, the first thing we need to do is, you notice there's a little slot in the middle. And so you can either join them together, or if you don't want to use a split ring, you can attach the hook directly to the shank. So I start my thread kind of towards the back here. Get those legs of the shank bound down. Make sure I get both sides bound down well. And you can go heavy on the thread here because it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. So we're going to cover this whole bit up here in a second. Okay, once we get that tied in there, okay, so we need something to cover up part of the shank. We're not going to dress the hook until we get up here towards the front. We're going to take our eye, and we're going to dress up. We're going to leave it blank for about half of that. So you can use anything to cover up that kind of bare metal on that shank there. A couple strands of flash glue twisted together works real well. You could just use thread with a little bit of head cement or lacquer over it. You could use diamond braid or anything else that looks good to you. Doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. One thing I find that helps me if I'm using a couple of strands of flashy glue is to put a little bit of nail polish on that thread and then wind the flashy glue through that, and it helps hold it in place a bit better. We'll just wrap that up all the way to the end there. And get ready to kind of wrap in our collar here. So essentially doing the collar, we're going to do the same thing that we did on the back half of the fly. Except instead of just doing one thin little collar back here, we're going to do a couple of different collars. And we're going to bring it on up to, just behind the bend where, you know, what would be the regular hook eye there, and we'll tie it off. And you can do it out of bucktail, you can do it out of synthetic stuff. You can add flash to it if you want. I generally just tie it out plain bucktail. I don't really add a whole lot of flash to the head because I think there's plenty in the backside of the fly that makes it work. I'll do just a couple of loose wraps and make sure it goes all the way around the shank. And crank it tight and press it back. And sometimes a nice contrasting color in here, especially when we get up towards the top, looks good. And sometimes fish just like to see just plain. All right, let's get another lift of bucktail in here. Just kind of wrap that back in there, and I think we're going to add a little bit of contrast to the front of this. We'll put a little bit of pink in there. All right, once we get to the front of this, we'll just tie it off like we would anything else. A half hitch and a whip finish. And cut that thread off. And now we'll take our fish skull that we've already got the eyes attached in and glued down in. And these are great because they cut out a lot of extra time, but it just goes over top and kind of smushes everything back and makes a real nice compact head for us. So, and they're super easy. You just squirt some super glue inside them. Run them back on here and make sure that it's centered up, kind of in the middle of the slot there, and it's not kind of all slanty and cockeyed. And then usually what I do is I'll put my thread back on here, and just build up a little bubble of thread right in front of this. To help hold it in place. Tie that off, and then we'll take one of these light activated polymers. I use CCG. This is one of the Loon ones, and basically I'll fill in all the cracks and areas around the mouth of it with that. Okay, so now for the hard part. We need to get the back section of our fly attached to the front section of our fly. And if you're like me, getting that split ring attached to the back side of this to this shank usually requires a pair of pliers, because it's little and my fingers just aren't that strong anymore. So we'll just grab a pair of pliers and run that split ring on the shank, and it doesn't really matter. You can set it so the hook is up or the hook is down. I usually set them so the hook's down, kind of just the way everything is. But I don't think it makes a lot of difference in how well you can hook the fish, and I don't think it really makes a whole lot of difference to the fish because he's still getting a hook stuck in his face. Sometimes it's a little easier if we stick the hook in the vise. And if you got a pair of split ring pliers that'll move these big split rings, it comes in handy. If not, it's just a matter of stabbing your fingers a couple of times until you can get it opened up and get everything assembled. There we go. She's ready to fish. You get plenty of length, got nice big eyes, got plenty of flash and wiggle. And hopefully we'll have her sticking out with something big and toothy tomorrow.